What would you do if three children who vanished more than 40 years ago were discovered deep inside a sealed Appalachian cavern, perfectly preserved, untouched by time, and arranged with a precision no natural force could explain? Before investigators could even determine how their bodies remained intact, another question emerged. Why were they placed there at all? This was no accident, no product of wilderness or weather. It was deliberate. And the closer authorities looked, the more the cave resembled a chamber built for a purpose no one was prepared to confront. This case did not begin with answers. It began with contradictions, decades-old missing persons reappearing without decay, markings carved into stone that matched no local history, and a location so inaccessible that human intervention seemed impossible. What happened inside that cavern defied every assumption investigators carried with them into the mountains. And as the first team stepped into the darkness, they realized the cave wasn't simply the scene of a disappearance. It was the opening move in something engineered long before anyone reached Stillwater Gap. The discovery that followed would turn a forgotten cold case into the most unsettling investigation of their careers. Before we begin, tell us in the comments that where are you watching from and what time is it over there right now? And if you're drawn to stories buried in isolation, mystery, and the remnants of forgotten histories, make sure you subscribe to X Archives so you never miss what waits in the shadows of the next case. The search teams had pushed deeper into the Appalachian Range than most locals ever dared, following a pattern of ground depressions and disrupted soil that suggested an unseen cavity beneath the forest floor. Their advance halted when a collapsed section of rock exposed a narrow passage, sealed for decades. The opening was unstable, but its position matched no known mining routes, shelters, or natural formations. Once inside, the responders noted that the air felt unmoving, as if preserved rather than circulating. Even before lights revealed the chamber, there was an unmistakable sense that the space had remained undisturbed since long before the boys vanished. The cavern widened into a smooth basin where three bodies rested in a deliberate triangular arrangement. Each boy, Eli, Jonah, and Caleb, lay on his back with arms positioned in identical angles, showing no signs of distress or injury. Despite being missing for over 40 years, their features remained unchanged from the photographs archived at the time of their disappearance. Skin retained elasticity, clothing showed no aging, and hair displayed no deterioration. The absence of decay contradicted every known biological expectation, especially in a sealed environment lacking airflow, light, or temperature regulation. Markings along the inner walls appeared etched rather than naturally formed. They followed patterns too consistent to be geological and too orderly to be accidental. Their placement aligned directly with the boys' arrangement, suggesting purposeful design rather than coincidence. The responding team documented each section carefully, aware that nothing in the scene matched any known cultural or environmental precedent in the region. The configuration implied intent, although its purpose remained impossible to determine. Upon recovery, standard procedures were followed, and the case was transferred to state jurisdiction. Detective Cole Maddox assumed command as lead investigator, immediately assessing the improbability of the discovery. Maddox noted the condition of the remains contradicted the presumed circumstances of their disappearance, which had been treated as an unresolved missing persons case with no relevant leads for decades. Now their presence in a sealed cavern with no signs of natural preservation raised questions that exceeded local investigative capacity. Initial forensic inspections offered no clarity. Temperature readings inside the chamber did not support the idea of accidental mummification or environmental stasis. Soil samples lacked compounds typically associated with preservation. There was no evidence of external containment measures, artificial materials, or intervention. The visual perfection of the bodies, paired with the structured arrangement, presented a contradiction that could not be matched to any known pathology. Upon recovery, standard procedures were followed, and the case was transferred to state jurisdiction. Detective Cole Maddox assumed command as lead investigator, immediately assessing the improbability of the discovery. Maddox noted the condition of the remains contradicted the presumed circumstances of their disappearance, which had been treated as an unresolved missing persons case with no relevant leads for decades. Now their presence in a sealed cavern with no signs of natural preservation raised questions that exceeded local investigative capacity. Initial forensic inspections offered no clarity. Temperature readings inside the chamber did not support the idea of accidental mummification or environmental stasis. Soil samples lacked compounds typically associated with preservation. There was no evidence of external containment measures, artificial materials, or intervention.
The visual perfection of the bodies, paired with the structured arrangement, presented a contradiction that could not be matched to any known pathology. Upon recovery, standard procedures were followed, and the case was transferred to state jurisdiction. The transfer from the recovery site to the laboratory was handled with controlled precision, yet even under optimal conditions, nothing about the specimens aligned with expectations. Dr. Miriam Hale began her examination the moment the boys were secured in isolation. Standard protocols were carried out without deviation, allowing her to determine whether the initial field observations had been influenced by lighting, temperature, or environmental distortion. Instead, the controlled setting only reinforced the impossibility of what she was seeing. Every preliminary test returned values inconsistent with human biology. Basic readings showed metabolic inactivity, yet tissues behaved as though still viable. Dr. Hale repeated the initial assays, assuming procedural error or calibration faults. Each rerun produced the same anomalies. She progressed through more advanced genetic sequencing equipment, expecting at least one machine to fail or produce corrupted output. None did. The results, however, defied every principle she had been trained to trust. The first indication of a deeper problem surfaced when the DNA sequences returned irregular base pair structures. A full analysis revealed additional chromosome pairs beyond the human standard, a configuration that should not support life, let alone match individuals unchanged for more than 40 years. Unknown proteins threaded through the samples, forming patterns with no documented analog. The sequences also displayed subtle shifts between repeated scans, as if actively reorganizing on a microscopic level. These shifts occurred without environmental triggers, ruling out contamination. Attempts to determine biological age only added to the contradictions. Chronological records placed the boys' disappearance over 40 years earlier, yet the tissues corresponded to individuals who had not aged at all. Markers typically used to estimate degradation were absent, replaced with stable structures that resisted decay under every test. Even when subjected to chemical and thermal conditions designed to break down organic matter, the samples maintained structural integrity far beyond any known biological threshold. Dr. Hale broadened the testing parameters, hoping a larger dataset would reveal hidden variables. Instead, the expanded results reinforced the abnormality. Cellular matrices remained intact despite repeated attempts to disrupt them. Enzymatic responses deviated from expected ranges, forming patterns that could not be classified. Attempts to compare the findings with national and international genetic databases returned no matches, leaving her without a frame of reference to contextualize the data. By the time she compiled her preliminary notes, Dr. Hale recognized that the evidence required escalation. The combination of unaltered physical appearance, anomalous genetic architecture, and resistance to decay exceeded what any state-level forensic unit was prepared to assess. Protocol demanded that cases presenting biological contradictions be forwarded for federal review, particularly when they involved minors or historical disappearances. This case met every criterion with unprecedented clarity. Her final summary for state authorities highlighted the critical points: the presence of extra chromosome pairs, unclassifiable proteins, shifting sequences, abnormal preservation, and complete misalignment between biological age and documented history. Each factor alone warranted further investigation. Combined, they represented an event outside established scientific understanding.
Each factor alone warranted further investigation. Combined, they represented an event outside established scientific understanding. Once transmitted, the file triggered immediate interest beyond her department. The findings signaled that the case was no longer confined to forensic pathology, but part of a broader concern requiring national oversight. The investigation, now moving into federal territory, would advance far beyond the boundaries of Miriam Hale's laboratory.
What began as an attempt to contextualize 3 preserved boys expanded into a historical investigation that reached far beyond a single disappearance. As state authorities requested background material, researchers began combing through archival records, property logs, school registries, and church documents tied to Stillwater Gap. The aim was straightforward: determine whether any past events resembled the current case. Instead, the data revealed a recurring pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The earliest documented disappearance occurred more than a century earlier, involving a group of children last seen on the outskirts of land owned by the Hallowell family. Their case remained unresolved, with no bodies recovered and no evidence explaining their absence. 40 years later, another cluster of missing children surfaced in the same region, again with no traces found. Every 40 decades afterward, new entries appeared in town records. Small groups of children gone without explanation, each case quietly noted and then abandoned when no physical evidence emerged. As analysts mapped these incidents along a timeline, the regularity of the intervals became undeniable. Every cycle involved children living near or traveling through areas controlled or influenced by the Hallowells. The proximity was consistent enough that researchers began examining the family genealogy to determine whether they played a direct role or simply lived adjacent to repeated tragedies. That inquiry uncovered another layer of irregularity. Generational charts of the Hallowell family were fragmented. Birth records appeared without corresponding death entries. Some children listed in early census data vanished from later documentation without relocation forms, marriage licenses, or burial logs. Spousal information was incomplete, and in some cases, entire branches ended abruptly with no recorded explanation. The inconsistencies did not resemble typical archival loss. They formed deliberate gaps, as if sections of the family history had been selectively obscured. Further review of property transactions revealed a repeated name associated with the Hallowell lineage: Malachi Ashford. His signature appeared on land deeds spanning multiple eras, each time attached to decisions involving inheritance or boundary modifications. Church records referenced him as a benefactor during decades where no matching civilian registrations existed. His involvement persisted across periods separated by lifetimes, yet no official documentation confirmed his birth, residence, or death within Stillwater Gap or neighboring counties. The frequency of his appearances, combined with the absence of personal records, positioned Ashford as a central figure within the pattern. His role in influencing family pairings and property divisions implied a calculated approach rather than a ceremonial presence. As genealogists cross-referenced the Hallowell lineage with the disappearance cycles, the connections strengthened. Many of the missing children shared distant ties to the family, even when their households lived miles away. These links suggested a broader design, one not limited to a single branch, but woven through the region's population over generations. By the time the historical study reached federal reviewers, the implications were clear. The disappearances were not isolated events, but stages of a long-term sequence. The Hallowell family, through manipulated lineage and recurring external influence, appeared positioned at the center of an orchestrated cycle extending more than a century. The discovery reframed the investigation from a forensic anomaly into a multi-generational construct, establishing groundwork for the deeper revelations still ahead. The transition from routine containment to crisis began without warning. Technicians arriving for a scheduled review found the storage wing unresponsive, its monitoring systems locked in a frozen state. Access panels flickered irregularly, and internal sensors displayed conflicting data. What should have been a controlled environment holding 3 inert bodies immediately signaled that something had shifted beyond procedural failure. Attempts to restore the electric grid inside the isolation sector revealed widespread instability. Power surged through certain circuits while others remained completely inactive, forming a pattern unrelated to the facility's wiring layout. Backup generators activated and stalled in rapid succession, creating an inconsistent pulse that disrupted additional systems. Surveillance feeds from the containment room offered no clarity. Each camera produced either static, incomplete frames, or corrupted files that showed no usable imagery from the previous hours. When security personnel entered the wing manually, the containment units were empty. The restraints, sealed only minutes earlier, remained intact, yet all 3 bodies had vanished. There was no sign of forced entry, removal, or tampering with biometric locks. The absence of physical evidence left investigators without a plausible explanation for how the disappearance had occurred within a secured medical facility.
The search shifted from procedural to urgent when motion sensors elsewhere in the building detected activity inconsistent with staff or authorized personnel. The signatures were faint but moved with coordinated timing, triggering alerts across multiple zones. Responders followed the readings through hallways that showed no footprints or physical disturbance. The signals converged near a diagnostic wing where a secondary team located Eli, Jonah, and Caleb standing together, fully conscious and visibly unchanged from the condition in which they were originally found. Medical staff initiated immediate assessment. Despite their appearance, the boys displayed physiological readings that exceeded every known metric. Heart rates, neural responses, and metabolic indicators operated at levels incompatible with typical human function. Their brain activity presented an even greater anomaly. Each boy's neurological output aligned perfectly with the others, forming synchronized patterns as if connected through a shared network. Observers noted that they moved with precise coordination. Turns, steps, and shifts in posture occurred simultaneously without hesitation or delay. Their awareness extended beyond simple responsiveness. They appeared to anticipate the presence of staff, orienting themselves before anyone entered the room. These behaviors suggested familiarity not only with their surroundings, but with the sequence of actions occurring around them. Given the escalating irregularities and the inability of local authorities to interpret the situation, the case transitioned to federal jurisdiction. Agent Marcial Vega assumed command under emergency protocols, initiating full lockdown procedures to contain the event. The medical wing was sealed, and external communication channels were redirected through federal oversight. Initial reports submitted to her office outlined the impossibility of the boys' disappearance, their biological shift, and the synchronized traits that emerged upon their return. The awakening signaled the end of the case's forensic stage. What had begun as an examination of preserved remains now advanced into an active and unexplained phenomenon requiring national attention. The scope of the investigation expanded immediately, marking a decisive turning point in how the situation would be handled from that point forward.
Agent Marcial Vega moved the investigation out of state control with a level of urgency that left little doubt about the severity of the situation. Dr. Miriam Hale and Detective Cole Maddox were transferred to a secure federal site where access required multiple layers of clearance. The transition marked a shift from local anomaly to a matter that had already been on federal radar long before the boys were recovered. Inside the briefing room, the environment reflected a unit accustomed to operating behind restricted channels. Director Silas Ward led the session, presenting himself not as an administrator encountering the case for the first time, but as someone revisiting an active file. Without preamble, he initiated a review of classified reports, revealing that Stillwater Gap had been monitored for decades due to recurring biological and environmental disturbances. The earliest entries documented sudden electromagnetic surges originating near Hallowell territory. These events correlated with prior disappearance cycles, each spike appearing in the weeks or months leading up to children vanishing. Teams dispatched during earlier investigations failed to return, and subsequent recovery missions produced incomplete logs or compromised equipment. Ward emphasized that these anomalies were never random. They followed patterns that mirrored the present case with striking consistency. A series of historical images displayed recovered remains from previous decades. Children preserved with the same inexplicable conditions seen in Eli, Jonah, and Caleb. Ward clarified that these cases had been archived under restricted access due to their unresolved nature and the absence of technological means to analyze them at the time. Attempts to transport those bodies had been met with similar disruptions, including power failures and equipment malfunctions, preventing meaningful examination. The parallels left no doubt that the events now unfolding were part of a recurring sequence. Documentation also included field notes from scientists who attempted to probe the earlier cycles. Their findings pointed toward unusual genetic indicators,
but the technology of their era had not been capable of capturing sequences with the precision achieved in Dr. Hale's lab. Even so, the earlier assessments acknowledged structures and protein signatures outside known classifications. These fragments supported the conclusion that the boys' biological anomalies were neither spontaneous nor isolated. Ward then introduced a set of predictions created by analysts who had studied the historical intervals. The patterns suggested that the reappearance of children, unchanged and biologically inconsistent with human norms, was expected to recur at specific points. According to these projections, the current awakening aligned exactly with the timeline anticipated by federal observers. The disappearance of Eli, Jonah, and Caleb 40 years prior had been flagged at the time, but without supportive evidence, the event remained contained within internal speculation. The convergence of Dr. Hale's findings, the boys' awakening, and the ongoing environmental disturbances confirmed that the phenomenon was part of a long-standing cycle previously misunderstood in scope. Ward stated that the event could no longer be categorized as a forensic or missing persons investigation. Instead, it represented the latest phase of an extended process monitored through multiple generations. With this reclassification, operational control shifted fully to Ward's division. The team now faced a phenomenon that had been evolving quietly for decades and was entering a stage far beyond preliminary containment. The implications set the direction for everything that would follow, marking the investigation's progression into a territory shaped not by isolated anomalies, but by an established pattern with a trajectory of its own. The investigative team reached the Hallowell settlement with the intention of clarifying the historical irregularities uncovered in the genealogical review. What awaited them was a community that carried its history quietly, with little willingness to illuminate the gaps that had emerged across generations. Dr. Miriam Hale, Detective Cole Maddox, and Agent Marisol Vega approached the meeting prepared for resistance, but the degree of guardedness they encountered exceeded expectation. The elders who met them offered cooperation only in form, not in substance. Their responses avoided direct engagement with questions about missing relatives or incomplete records. When asked about branches of the family that abruptly ended in the logs, they redirected the discussion toward irrelevant details or cited poor documentation practices from decades past. The inconsistencies in their statements mirrored the patterns discovered in archival research, reinforcing the notion that the omissions were intentional rather than accidental. Inside the primary residence, the team reviewed family documents stored in wooden chests and bound ledgers. Many of the birth entries were annotated in handwriting that did not match the surrounding records, suggesting updates added after the fact. Some names appeared without associated dates, while others contained only initials. Entire pages were removed from certain registries, leaving behind uneven remnants where sheets had been torn out. These irregularities aligned with the genealogical gaps previously identified, confirming that the lineage had been altered repeatedly across multiple eras. As the team compared these physical records to the data compiled in federal archives, a broader pattern emerged. Generations of the Hallowell family appeared to have been organized around intentional pairings, each reinforcing specific branches while allowing others to disappear from documentation entirely. This structure mirrored the manipulated lineage models referenced in the classified files. The absence of some family members from community accounts was not the result of displacement or attrition, but the outcome of a sustained process designed to refine the bloodline. Throughout the questioning, the name Malachi Ashford surfaced consistently. Though the elders avoided providing detailed explanations, they referenced him with a level of familiarity that suggested long-standing influence. Their remarks implied he was more than an advisor. He played a decisive role in determining which children were chosen within each generation. None of the elders provided a time frame for his presence, only that he appeared whenever the family faced what they termed the necessary moment. The absence of age-related descriptions reinforced the irregularity surrounding his identity. When the investigators redirected the discussion toward the disappearance of Eli, Jonah, and Caleb, the elders' demeanor shifted. They did not describe the boys as missing or lost, but as part of a cycle anticipated long before their absence. Their phrasing indicated expectancy rather than grief or confusion, suggesting that the boys' return aligned with a timeline internally understood by the family. This stance corresponded with patterns uncovered in federal records that documented similar attitudes during previous cycles. By the end of the interview, the team had gathered limited verbal information, but substantial contextual insight. The evasiveness of the elders, the manipulated genealogical documents, and the repeated reference to Ashford collectively reinforced that the Hallowell lineage had been shaped over generations for a specific purpose. The implication that the boys' reappearance fulfilled an anticipated stage removed the event from the category of unexplained anomaly and placed it within a structured, deliberate continuum. The testimony concluded without overt obstruction, yet the lack of clarity only underscored the significance of what had been concealed. The investigation now had a defined trajectory, pointing directly toward the long-standing internal mechanisms that governed the family and the cycle they upheld.
As federal teams expanded their monitoring radius around Stillwater Gap, the first indications of a broader shift emerged through changes in regional wildlife patterns. Animals that typically navigated the forested terrain with predictable routes began avoiding entire sections of the landscape. Tracks showed abrupt directional changes, and motion-triggered sensors recorded prolonged absences of species normally present year-round. The withdrawal did not correspond to seasonal behavior or predatory threats. Instead, it formed a widening ring around the area connected to the boys' recovery. Meteorological stations soon detected irregular weather fluctuations concentrated around Hallowell territory. Short-lived atmospheric disturbances surfaced without correlation to larger systems, generating pockets of instability that shifted with no discernible trigger. These anomalies disrupted local forecasts and produced temperature variations confined to narrow corridors. The patterns mirrored disturbances noted in historical federal reports, reinforcing that the current events aligned with previous cycles. Simultaneously, infrastructure surrounding Stillwater Gap began to show coordinated failures. Power grids across multiple sectors experienced synchronized disruptions that could not be attributed to mechanical defects or overloaded circuits. Engineers reported precise timing across distant substations, suggesting an external influence affecting the system simultaneously at multiple points. Diagnostic equipment flagged the failures as electrical interference without a detectable source. Within the laboratory, the anomalies manifested in more controlled yet equally concerning forms. Materials that had been exposed to tissue samples from Eli, Jonah, and Caleb began exhibiting changes at the cellular level. Standard growth media shifted in composition, forming structures that resisted classification. Even sterilized containers showed traces of biological alteration despite safeguards designed to prevent exposure. These transformations occurred without contamination events, indicating that the influence extended through indirect contact. Soil and water samples collected near the discovery site displayed similar deviations. Chemical assays revealed proteins absent from any known environmental profile. These compounds formed repeating configurations that remained stable across varying conditions. The signatures were scattered but followed a discernible pattern: highest concentration at the cave site and decreasing gradually outward. This gradient provided measurable evidence of a spreading effect linked to the boys' presence. As data accumulated, analysts compiled geographical overlays to track the perimeter of influence. Each new disturbance, whether in wildlife behavior, environmental instability, infrastructure disruption, or lab anomalies, fell along an expanding boundary. The circumference grew steadily, matching projections based on earlier cycles documented in federal archives.
The consistency of the expansion confirmed that the phenomenon was not random, but following a progression previously observed on smaller scales. Agent Marisol Vega's division concluded that the awakening had initiated a process extending beyond biological irregularity. The interconnected disturbances formed a pattern in which environmental, technological, and organic systems responded to the same underlying cause. The boys were at the center of that response, their presence generating measurable effects across multiple domains. This assessment marked a turning point in the federal approach. What had begun as an isolated genetic anomaly was now demonstrably influencing the broader region. The shift required updated protocols and recalibrated containment strategies, acknowledging that the event was no longer confined to the laboratory or the Hallowell settlement. The spread was active, measurable, and accelerating, setting the stage for the next phase of the investigation. The investigation into the Hallowell lineage entered a new phase when analysts uncovered a collection of letters stored in county archives, private estates, and seized materials from earlier inquiries. Although scattered across different decades and locations, each document pointed back to one individual, Malachi Ashford. The handwriting remained consistent despite a span approaching a century, and the tone in every letter carried an authoritative certainty that implied deep involvement in directing the family's generational structure. The earliest correspondence outlined recommendations for specific unions within the Hallowell bloodline. These instructions did not read as suggestions, but as directives, referencing traits that needed to be preserved or combined. Later letters echoed these objectives with increasing precision, identifying which branches should continue and which should be allowed to fade from record. The pattern matched the genealogical anomalies already documented: sudden disappearances from family charts, selective pairing, and deliberate gaps across multiple eras. Parallel to these civilian findings, federal intelligence files revealed sightings of Ashford spaced decades apart, each describing a man whose appearance showed no measurable change. Locations varied, from rural settlements to government-monitored sectors near Stillwater Gap, but the descriptions aligned too closely to disregard. Internal analysts attempted to attribute the consistency to mistaken identity or recycled rumors, but the repeated nature of the reports undermined those explanations. The same name, the same features, the same role, appearing whenever the cycle approached a significant point. Earlier attempts by researchers to study Ashford were documented but sealed soon after their creation. These files, marked with high-level classification, detailed unsuccessful efforts to apprehend or interview him. Equipment failures, missing field notes, and personnel losses across multiple operations. The investigations concluded abruptly, with the final pages indicating that future engagements should be postponed until more information could be gathered. No such opportunity had arisen since. As investigators connected these findings with the anomalies surrounding the boys, Ashford's influence became increasingly clear. He had not served as a background figure or ceremonial advisor. His directives shaped the Hallowell lineage across generations, ensuring that specific genetic attributes converged at defined intervals. The engineered nature of these pairings aligned with the unusual biological markers identified in Eli, Jonah, and Caleb, suggesting that the anomalies in their DNA were neither accidental nor spontaneous. Further analysis of historical letters revealed references to milestones that paralleled the disappearance and reappearance cycles documented in federal archives. Phrases outlining the appointed return or the moment of alignment appeared repeatedly, hinting that Ashford had anticipated the timing long before the contemporary investigation began. Notes preserved from mid-century correspondence indicated an expectation that the boys' awakening would coincide with broader environmental changes, patterns now manifesting across Stillwater Gap. The consistency of these elements, letters spanning nearly a century, sightings of a man unchanged across decades, classified files documenting failed research attempts, and lineage shaped according to specific instructions, established Ashford as the architect behind the generational cycle. His involvement was neither symbolic nor peripheral. It was foundational, shaping every stage that led to the present. By consolidating these archival fragments, investigators recognized that the phenomenon unfolding around Stillwater Gap followed a design orchestrated long before any current officials were aware of it. The boys' return fit precisely into a structure engineered over decades, confirming that the cycle now advancing was not an unexpected anomaly, but the intended result of Ashford's enduring plan.
The internal changes within Eli, Jonah, and Caleb became evident as soon as medical staff initiated comprehensive monitoring. Although their outward appearance remained unaltered, the data revealed rapid restructuring occurring beneath the surface. Organ systems displayed shifts in density and activity that did not correspond to any recognized biological process. Metabolic readings fluctuated in synchronized intervals, rising and stabilizing in precise patterns shared across all three boys. Neural scans provided the most significant insight. What began as elevated brainwave activity soon evolved into a networked response, linking the boys into a unified system. Patterns originating in one child appeared instantly in the others, forming a shared structure that operated as a single cognitive entity. This connection remained constant regardless of their physical placement within the facility. Technicians confirmed that the neural alignment did not reflect communication, but integration, a collective pattern functioning without central leadership or hierarchy. As the phenomenon intensified, environmental disturbances inside the building expanded. Instruments detected fluctuations in electromagnetic fields aligning with each wave of synchronized neural activity. Hallway lights dimmed and brightened in intervals matching their internal rhythms, while nearby electronic devices malfunctioned in bursts that corresponded to the boys' physiological changes. These distortions did not cause structural damage, but demonstrated an expanding zone of influence tied directly to their presence. Staff working in close proximity reported sensations that appeared as nonverbal communication. These impressions were not auditory or visual, but experienced as abrupt clarity or direction, difficult to articulate yet consistent across personnel. The content of these impressions varied, but each report conveyed a sense of intent originating from the boys, not as individuals, but as a unified consciousness. Psychological evaluations ruled out mass suggestion or shared stress responses, reinforcing that the effect stemmed from an external source. One of the most striking observations concerned how the boys navigated the facility. Despite having no prior exposure to its layout, they moved through corridors with precise understanding of spatial arrangements. They avoided restricted zones unless guided there, responded to approaching personnel before they arrived, and shifted positions in perfect synchrony. Their movements revealed awareness not only of their environment, but of each other's intentions, acting as extensions of the same directive. Behavioral specialists reviewing the footage concluded that the boys were not acting randomly or reacting solely to external stimuli. Their patterns suggested preparation for an orchestrated action. Every shift in posture, every synchronized step, and every coordinated response appeared deliberate. While the exact purpose remained unclear, the consistency in their behavior indicated alignment toward a specific objective. This convergence of internal transformation, unified neural activity, environmental disruption, and synchronized movement reframed the investigation. What had begun as an anomaly requiring scientific explanation had evolved into a phenomenon suggestive of an emergent species event. The evidence no longer pointed to isolated irregularities, but to a structured developmental phase. The team recognized that the boys were progressing through stages beyond the scope of conventional understanding. Each development reinforced the trajectory documented in earlier cycles and aligned with predictions tied to their awakening. The investigation now faced the onset of a coordinated shift whose implications extended far beyond Stillwater Gap, indicating that the next phase was already underway. The first indication of a breach surfaced when the facility's internal monitoring grid registered simultaneous failures across multiple access points. Security doors that required independent authentication disengaged in unison, bypassing protocols designed to prevent coordinated override. These failures did not follow the pattern of mechanical malfunction. Instead, they unfolded with precise timing that matched the synchronized physiological rhythms previously documented in Eli, Jonah, and Caleb. Moments later, surveillance across entire corridors collapsed. Cameras that operated on separate power sources shut down in the same second, producing no transitional frames or corrupted footage, only complete absence. Attempts to restore the feeds yielded nothing, as if the systems had never recorded during the period in question. Technical teams confirmed that no external interference had entered the network. The interruption originated internally, aligned to the same coordinated pattern that had begun influencing environmental systems throughout the investigation. Personnel stationed near the containment wing reported sudden disorientation. Some experienced brief gaps in memory, while others noted altered perception of distance and sound. These effects appeared and resolved quickly, leaving staff unable to reconstruct the precise sequence of events. Their accounts varied in detail, but shared one consistent element: awareness that something had passed them without physical contact, leaving behind distortions rather than observable movement. During this window, the boys exited the containment sector. No alarms activated and no access logs registered their passage. Yet when emergency crews reached the exterior perimeter, Eli, Jonah, and Caleb were already outside the facility, standing in the open as if the route they followed had posed no impediment. The absence of physical force, tool usage, or damage indicated that the breach had not relied on conventional methods. Their synchronized progression through secured areas confirmed an ability to override systems without interacting with them directly. As the boys emerged outdoors, sensors across Stillwater Gap detected a powerful electromagnetic pulse radiating outward in all directions. Communication networks flickered and dropped offline. Satellite connections destabilized, and regional power infrastructure momentarily collapsed. The pulse did not produce long-term structural damage, but demonstrated a level of energy output far beyond anything previously recorded in the area. Its timing matched the exact moment the boys crossed the facility boundary. Federal Command responded immediately. Director Silas Ward declared the situation a national threat, citing the scale, coordination, and implications of the breach. The combination of synchronized system failures, widespread sensory disruption among personnel, and region-wide electromagnetic impact confirmed that the event had escalated beyond localized containment. Emergency directives shifted from analysis to strategic response, prioritizing protection of surrounding communities and stabilization of critical infrastructure. The incident redefined the parameters of the investigation. What had once been considered an anomalous biological case had now demonstrated the capacity to alter secured systems, influence human perception, and affect regional technology. Eli, Jonah, and Caleb no longer represented isolated subjects under observation. They were active agents within a rapidly expanding phenomenon operating on multiple levels.
By the time facility operations stabilized, the implications were clear. The breach marked the beginning of a new phase, one that aligned precisely with progression outlined in historical cycles and confirmed the scope of the transformation underway.
Reports from field agents near the original cave site marked the moment the investigation entered its most critical stage. Observers documented the appearance of a man matching every known description of Malachi Ashford. an individual referenced across nearly a century of records without any measurable change in age or physical condition. The sighting occurred in proximity to the area where Eli, Jonah, and Caleb were first recovered, reinforcing long-standing suspicions that his presence was directly tied to each major phase of the cycle. Federal intercepts compiled from earlier decades confirmed that Ashford had been witnessed at activation points during previous awakenings. These sightings originated from separate sources across different eras, yet each account described the same features with no indication of aging. Personnel involved in earlier investigations noted identical posture, gait, and demeanor regardless of the year. Analysts revisiting those reports identified a consistent pattern. Ashford surfaced shortly before the most significant transformations began, then disappeared once the cycle progressed beyond a certain threshold. His current movements aligned precisely with changes occurring within the Hallowell lineage. Activation markers recorded in family members corresponded with locations Ashford approached or crossed. The correlation held even when contact was indirect, suggesting that his presence served as a catalyst rather than a passive observation. Tracking teams attempting to follow him found that he moved with purpose, selecting routes that traced the expanding perimeter of the phenomenon as if monitoring the progression he had set into motion. Archive documentation from past encounters revealed attempts by federal operatives to approach or detain Ashford. These efforts never reached conclusion. Records indicated that he withdrew from engagement at the moment the cycle advanced into its next phase, leaving incomplete notes and unresolved investigations behind him. Equipment failures, communication disruptions, and unexplained environmental anomalies were common features of these aborted pursuits, mirroring the disturbances now occurring at a far greater scale. When Director Silas Ward received confirmation of Ashford's reappearance, he convened an emergency briefing to reassess containment protocols. The convergence of active lineage transformations, global signal propagation, and the boy's earlier breach left little doubt that the phenomenon had reached a stage consistent with historical predictions. Ward ordered full containment, despite acknowledging internally that available resources offered limited control over an event of this magnitude. The directive emphasized monitoring, securing critical infrastructure, and preparing for effects that exceeded operational precedents. Intelligence analysts reviewing Ashford's trajectory concluded that his return signaled the onset of the final phase of the awakening. His consistent appearance at equivalent points in previous cycles indicated that the transformations underway had reached a threshold he anticipated. Nothing in the record suggested he interfered directly with the process. Instead, his presence served as a confirmation that the sequence was unfolding according to its established design. The reappearance of Ashford solidified his role within the broader structure of the phenomenon. His unchanged form, documented movements, and historical involvement demonstrated that he was not an external observer but an integral component of the cycle's progression. As containment measures intensified and federal teams positioned themselves for the next developments, it became evident that the investigation had advanced into its most decisive stage, one aligned not with speculation, but with the patterns that had repeated across generations. The shift into the final phase became apparent when Eli, Jonah, and Caleb's neural signatures surged past every previously recorded threshold. Monitoring stations across multiple agencies confirmed that their synchronized output aligned exactly with the global pulses detected in earlier stages. The timing was exact, forming a continuous pattern that matched projections derived from historical cycles. This alignment marked the activation point long anticipated but never fully documented in prior generations. As the neural escalation continued, the terrain surrounding Stillwater Gap underwent measurable alteration. Geological sensors registered subtle but persistent reorganization of surface structures. Soil patterns arranged themselves into stable formations that held shape despite wind, erosion, or environmental disruption. These configurations emerged in concentric sequences that radiated outward, mirroring the same geometric consistency noted in the boy's neural mappings. The terrain did not collapse or deform catastrophically. Instead, it settled into an ordered arrangement that persisted without external reinforcement. Concurrently, the biological changes within the Hallowell family accelerated. Descendants who had shown early signs of activation now displayed complete alignment with the boys' patterns. Their physiological markers synchronized in perfect intervals, matching the global signal with near zero deviation. Medical teams recorded a surge of genetic expression in dormant sequences, marking the culmination of modifications engineered across generations. The responses occurred uniformly, regardless of age or branch, supporting the conclusion that the lineage had reached its intended state. Federal systems designed to interpret complex data structures began failing as the convergence intensified. Analytical software returned incoherent outputs or flagged the incoming information as incompatible with existing frameworks. Attempts to translate the neural patterns into recognizable formats yielded fragmented sequences that shifted too rapidly for conventional processing. Engineers reported that the data did not present errors, it exceeded the limits of interpretation. This breakdown marked the moment when the phenomenon surpassed the boundaries of technological comprehension. Despite these failures, one aspect of the event stabilized across all monitoring stations. A sustained signal emerged, continuous and uniform, detectable from ground-based instruments to orbital platforms. The frequency held steady regardless of atmospheric conditions or distance from the Appalachian region. Its consistency across disparate detection systems confirmed that the signal was not a byproduct of environmental interference, but the defining output of the convergence phase. This sustained emission represented the culmination of the engineered lineage. All components, genetic, environmental, neurological, and atmospheric, aligned with precision. Each development followed the structure anticipated by earlier records, but on a scale far larger than any prior cycle. The convergence was not the beginning of a new pattern, nor a divergence from established sequences. It was the expression of an event planned across generations, executed through biological design and synchronized transformation. As the signal continued uninterrupted, the investigation reached a point of confirmation rather than interpretation. The process unfolding around Stillwater Gap no longer required analysis to determine its trajectory. It had completed the framework laid out through the boys, the lineage, and the phenomenon that shaped their existence. The convergence stood as the intended outcome, marking the completion of a sequence that had been advancing steadily towards this moment.
The final stage of the phenomenon became evident when Eli, Jonah, and Caleb entered a fully unified state. Their neurological patterns, once rapidly shifting through increasingly complex sequences, stabilized into a single coherent structure. This convergence signaled the completion of the cycle that had been building since their disappearance decades earlier. Monitors detected no further fluctuations or transitional phases. The boys had reached the endpoint anticipated by the data documented across previous generations. As this transformation settled, the environment surrounding Stillwater Gap began to assume a new equilibrium. Regions that had experienced irregular weather patterns, electromagnetic disturbances, and shifting terrain gradually aligned under consistent biological conditions. Soil composition stabilized with the anomalous protein structures integrated into its framework. Flora adapted without signs of stress, suggesting the altered ecosystem functioned under a set of emerging biological rules. The earlier unpredictability receded, replaced by a steady pattern that reflected the global signal established during the convergence. Within the Hallowell family, the progression reached its intended culmination. Descendants who had displayed partial activation now demonstrated complete adaptation. Genetic markers expressed uniformly across individuals, indicating that the lineage had fully transitioned into the form engineered through generations of deliberate pairing. Physiological assessments showed traits that diverged from baseline human parameters, yet remained consistent within the family. The responses to environmental stimuli aligned with the stabilized signal, confirming their integration into the newly established system. Worldwide, anomalies that had disrupted atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions settled into persistent patterns. These changes did not regress to prior states, but instead adopted a new baseline that reflected the transformed biological and environmental structure. Monitoring stations reported steady frequencies identical to the signal generated during the boys' final unification. This continuity indicated that the transformation was no longer an evolving phenomenon, but a completed event with long-term implications. Federal agencies evaluating the final datasets classified the occurrence not as an ongoing crisis, but as a permanent alteration. Reports emphasized that containment was no longer applicable, as the shift had extended beyond localized influence into a global framework. The focus transitioned toward documentation and adaptation rather than mitigation. This approach aligned with assessments from analysts who recognized that the system had reached stability and was not expected to revert. Underlying every development was the realization that the sequence had concluded exactly as designed. Malachi Ashford's influence, evident in the engineered lineage, the predicted timing, and the stage-by-stage progression had shaped the event with precision. His directives across decades had built a foundation for the transformation now complete. The unified state of Eli, Jonah, and Caleb marked the endpoint of his design, while the altered ecosystem and adapted lineage signaled the beginning of its long-term expression. As the investigation closed, the narrative shifted from attempting to understand each anomaly to acknowledging the establishment of a new paradigm. The cycle that had unfolded across generations had reached its final stage, revealing a transition that would redefine biological and environmental norms. The phenomenon ended not with disruption, but with the confirmation of an intended transformation, one that set the trajectory for the next phase of human evolution. If you've stayed with us to the end, let us know about how this case made you feel. Cases like this remind us that the most disturbing truths are often hidden in plain sight.